To begin with, sorry for being late with this update. I was helping to program an old HMI panel with poorly translated software, and that took way longer than it should have. And because of that, I ran out of time before I was supposed to switch to Shogun Showdown modding. So now I'm finishing this script in late January, despite it being about December progress. And this period of work on Divine Dream started with me continuing to work on the Chapter 4 map, or more specifically the rest of its map changes. And it was fairly good progress overall. Then I got these map changes corrupted twice. Once when I pressed undo one time too many, and it applied the size change from one map change to another, or at least I think that's what happened. And the second time when I was expanding the number of map changes for the map, and it just erased the last one. I did have a backup in both cases, but one I had to transfer by hand, and the other wasn't quite up to date, so both of them cost me some time. I'll get into more detail on the map changes later in the spoiler section. For now, suffice to say I've made 12 of them for this map, and half of them could be their own maps, despite the fact that I'll only use them in the opening cutscene. Afterwards, I returned to the still at the time unnamed chapter 2X, where my main goal was to set up some NPCs and unit placements, though I got sidetracked a fair bit for 3 separate reasons. One, that I haven't written any dialogue for this ROM hack in nearly a year, so I'd have to refamiliarize myself with how I was doing that, and I did not feel like doing so at the time. 2, that while working on these things, there were moments where I had to pause and consider design decisions that would affect the entire ROM hack. And 3, I just really hate setting up unit placements, because it seems to me like there should be some science to it, some understanding to be gained, or just a feeling for what's right, but I have neither and just have to guess. And when I have to guess, I hesitate. When I hesitate, things progress slowly, slow progress is frustrating, and I tend to procrastinate on tasks I find frustrating, which just makes the whole issue worse. But let's come back to that second thing, because it is something I can talk about without spoilers. And that is the philosophy I ended up with in regards to green units. Originally this chapter was going to have a group of generic NPCs, but a while back, I think it was during one of the few dev streams I did, Alex asked about a group of NPCs from an earlier chapter, who, despite not serving a role in the story, all get unique names, portraits, descriptions and death quotes, as well as a short cutscene when they first appear. Can't recall what the exchange was about exactly, but I believe one part of it was that Alex said that it was confusing, that these more or less background NPCs looked like they would be recruitable in some way. And I remembered that when considering details of the NPCs for this and the next chapter, because generic or not, some would still have conversations, meaning that they would need portraits. So should I use the generic ones from the vanilla game or look for something else? And then I had a thought, because this is a story about a goddess and the world of her creation. We are following her journey, seeing things from her perspective. And from her perspective, these green guys aren't just nameless villagers, it's Marcus the blacksmith and his daughter Sarah. Indirect as it may have been, Ilma has created all these people. She knows everything there is to know about them, being effectively omniscient within the bounds of her world. And she cares about this world not just as her creation, but as a living universe. Every part of it that is erased by the fiends is a tragedy to her, and doubly so when it comes to people. And I think I want to try to give the player the same feeling, that each time any character dies, no matter if they're player controlled or not, something unique is lost. To that end, I decided that every human unit in the ROM hack will be a character. Every ally of course, every unfortunate non-combatant caught in the crossfire, and yes, every enemy too, at least out of what few human enemies will appear during this ROM hack story. Everyone will get a name, a short description, portrait, death quote, and if I find the time, even a palette. Thanks to this hack's relatively small size, this should be achievable in spite of the GBA's limitations. Then in chapters themselves, I can also set up stuff like their combat AI and inventories to fit their characters. As a side benefit, this will also mean that I'll have to set things up in a way that makes the NPCs capable enough to not get themselves killed at first opportunity, which is something they are infamous for in the GBA games. After all that setup won't change the player's frustration if they lose a green unit at no fault of their own. And this of course doesn't extend to the fiends. They aren't characters, but rather a force of ontological evil. The ones that serve as bosses do have some intelligence to varied degrees, but it is simply used to command the lesser fiends and be more cunning in their shared goal of bringing the end to all existence. It was a decision I made early on for the sake of the story. If it's one that takes place within a world whose creator is the main character, then threats coming from within it don't really work. Not for the story I was envisioning in any case. This isn't a story about creation rebelling against its creator, and so for cases like this one, a physical manifestation of evil is a great enemy to have, because it's a tool that allows for representing any sort of mental or spiritual struggle as actual combat. It lets me make a story about a creator and her creations, joining forces to fight her metaphorical demons in the form of literal ones. It is also why I don't plan on having Bales, Cyclopses, Centaurs or Hounds appear as fiends. These types of monsters feel more normal. They are something that was often simply a part of the world in the mythologies where they originated. So to mark the fiends as explicitly being from beyond the world, I decided that they should all be one of two things, which was shaped somewhat by what battle animations are available, those being undead, or monstrous in a vaguely unnatural feeling way, Moguls being a perfect example of the latter. And there is one more design concept I can talk about before we get into spoilers, and that is the world's consistency. This game's story branches out in numerous places, various events having their own consequences on it. And through it all, I've been trying to keep a logical through line, which had two parts to it. First is that a branch can only occur as a logical consequence of the events. Sacred Stones is a perfect example of what I don't want. There, you get to choose which of the siblings to follow for the mid-game, but whichever you choose, both depart in the same directions and go through the same events, and yet the world changes around them in a way that in no way could have been caused by this decision. Characters appear on the other side of the continent just so you can recruit them, Leon focuses on talking with a different one of the lords and behaves completely differently. Many Fire Emblem games are also guilty of this in terms of guidance chapters and hidden route splits, for instance ones based on whether or not one group of characters had more experience than another. And just to clarify, I am not saying that it's a bad thing, I just have different goals with my design. Much like with making all human NPCs unique, my aim here is to create an image of a world that the game's story takes place in, rather than a world that exists only for the sake of the story. Especially because I'm aiming for replayability, and I imagine it will be more satisfying if on subsequent playthroughs you can see how your choices and actions shape the world in a consistent way. And that connects to the second part of the consistency, and that is the, let's say, modularity of the branches. If an event can occur in one branch, it should be able to occur in every other branch that doesn't actively prevent it. I really want to give an example because this idea lies somewhere between confusing and, of course that's how it's supposed to work, but I can't think of one that wouldn't have any spoilers. So I think that's all I can share without getting into more details. If you want to avoid spoilers, this is your time to click off. Thanks for watching, and again, sorry for being late with this devlog. And for people who remain, let's take a closer look at what I've been doing with the map changes. The first few map changes are rather straightforward. The map starts as a forest in the mountains, then becomes a rural area full of homes and wheat fields. Then, as Ilma attempts to remove the numerous caverns that give shelters to brigands, a lake is created as an unintended consequence of this shift in the mountain's shape, preventing two of the villages from ever being established. Trying to hastily fix that mistake, Ilma opts to have the southern mountains split into three separate peaks, so that there are channels between them that allow the water to drain faster. Quite a while ago, I made a note that this should be an action distinctly different from how she usually creates, acting upon the first thought she has rather than a thought-out plan, and being forceful in a way. And I thought that a neat way to represent it would be to have some kind of void open up in between them, as if the fabric of reality was torn apart. This idea then evolved somewhat. After all, it wouldn't make sense to have something like this happen just once and never again. So, as a side note, there will probably be fiends who through their rituals tear such holes in reality, but that's not in this chapter. In this chapter, the void will interact with a different recurring element, that being relic fragments. An optional collectible that gives you a slight stat boost when held, and will have a use in the endgame chapters. My plans were to have Ilma, by the end of this chapter's opening cutscene, try to create a shrine holding a legendary item, but have this creation fail, much like the previous ones, the item breaking apart into 3 relic fragments that you can collect during this chapter. For one reason or another, I decided that this setup wouldn't quite work, and to be honest I can't remember if it was because of the opening cutscene sequence of events, or because I decided that it didn't fully fit in lore-wise, and that instead the shrine would be created in an action that also caused more void scars to form, and then after a few turns of playing the chapter, the tiles would expand, consuming the building. Such expansions I thought of as a collapse or implosion of what's there, rather than it being completely erased. Thus the shrine and the mountain get pretty much crushed into dust, but the powerful magical item only gets shattered, pieces of it ejected out of the void. But of course, before I could implement any of these ideas, I needed a way to represent that void on the map, which meant drawing more new tiles, and before then, trying to figure out how to draw something like that in the first place. During this time, I also made myself a tool which would read an FEBuilder tilemap file and return the list of all subtiles that aren't used by any tile and thus can be safely replaced, since the farming fields ended up taking all the tiles I knew for sure were unused. And then my decision to stop using Windows the moment that Windows 10 stops being usable has been reinforced, as my computer decided to restart itself to install updates, despite me explicitly disabling the automatic updates. And that disruption has caused me the aforementioned work on figuring out the void tiles. Fortunately, these were just experiments. What I eventually figured out is that I could create animated tiles, specifically using the Type 1 map animation system, and to briefly explain, Type 2 is used for animating via color change, in the base games used for the volcanic levels. Type 1, meanwhile, is a full sprite replacement animation, used for animating water. And on the fields tile set, which I was using for this map, there were exactly 4 unused subtile slots set up for Type 1 animation. It was tricky to figure out how to fit everything I would need into these slots, but getting more of them would require literal corner cutting, as in taking the subtiles which happen to depict non-animated quarters of water tiles, moving them elsewhere on the chipset, and then going through every single tile that ever used that specific subtile to set the new coordinates where it should look for its corner piece. So I made do with 4. A horizontal piece, a vertical piece, an inner corner, and an outer corner, animated as particles being pulled into the void. And because I carefully chose which colors to use for them, I can swap the palette to have it fit as the void bordering water, plants, rocks, or buildings. The option to use a different palette for the same subtile already exists in GBA Fire Emblem games, as it does in most games on 2D consoles, though Fire Emblem doesn't seem to ever use it to have one tile in multiple color schemes. One issue I ran into is that this selection of 4 chips with multiple compatible palettes requires a lot of actual normal tiles, and the tile map also has limited space, albeit a large one being a 32 by 32 grid. I ended up with 27 different tiles used in this chapter alone, and that is after making some concessions that allowed me to reuse certain tiles in multiple places. So continuing the map changes, the mountains are torn apart, but things don't go back to 3 thriving villages. The water washes out gold from within the mountains, attracting people interested not in farming, but in panning in the river. Ilma is at this point more or less blindly trying things out, in hopes that she can make her vision work out. She adds a nearby castle, hoping an armed presence is going to help things out. She creates the aforementioned shrine of some relic, hoping it would become a place of worship and thus cared for. At this point her teacher stops her, pointing out that she should take time to think things through. Acting so hastily not only isn't solving the issues she has, but it is also attracting more and more fiends. So the remaining tile changes are things that can happen during the chapter. First, the rift consuming the shrine, then an entire set of tile changes, of the northern village being erased over the course of multiple turns, because I couldn't be normal and have one tile change for it getting erased entirely, then one tile change for that village being saved, and one more change for the house separate from the village getting erased. After that, as mentioned in the spoilerless section, I returned to chapter 2x. There I started figuring out how to handle a group of Sanctian monks, who will spawn in if you completed the previous chapter by running out of time, resulting in Noctar finishing his destruction ritual. If that happens, then the monastery on this map is inhabited, and its head monk will be interested in learning why a group of mercenaries is chasing monsters into the land under their control. That part I already decided a while ago. The tricky part was making the head monk, and the two monks accompanying him, behave in a manner that fits this idea. For the monks, I gave them the AI to follow their leader, the leader being set as the head monk, and hopefully the way I set them up will also make them prioritize survival. And the leader, a war monk, needs an AI that makes him walk over to someone and talk with them to question their intrusion into the Sanctian territory. But of course I have to decide who he would go to question. Valerie perhaps, being the leader of the party? But what if you didn't deploy her? It wouldn't make sense for them to stand around and do nothing in that case. So the AI needs backup targets, and initially I was thinking maybe Francis, being the priest, or Alvis, who looks like he could be in charge. But ultimately the only character I can ensure is going to be on the field is Ilma. And she's, a kid. If you're looking for someone to talk to in a team of mercenaries, she's going to be your last choice. But I also didn't want the AI to have to check up to 10 different characters each time it's deciding what to do. 4 is a more reasonable number though. It is also the best I could figure out by the justification that they would probably speak with the person leading the way. That would be Francis if available, otherwise Edwin, then Tammy, then Ilma. Now in the other direction, you will have a different selection of characters who can speak with the Sanctian leader, with varied results. Valerie of course, Francis and Ilma as well, where if someone else is leading the way, Ilma will have a different conversation from the one that happens if she's spoken to. And Sol, the fifth you might get to recruit at the end of the previous chapter, though it would take a very specific set of circumstances for you to both recruit him and get into this extra chapter. But I won't get into details now, both because I'm not sure how much of a spoiler that would be, and because I genuinely can't remember if I've talked about it already in one of these devlogs. Either way, that results in 7 different conversations that can happen, which I'm going to group into negative, neutral, and positive outcome ones, but I decided that I'm not really feeling up to writing dialogue without refamiliarizing myself with how I've been writing the characters first, so I pivoted to filling up the unit spawns, which, as mentioned before, might just be the thing I hate doing the most when it comes to Fire Emblem ROM hacking. So I've been procrastinating on it, sometimes by setting up other things for this chapter. Like the name. It's another thing I'm not too fond of doing, but nonetheless, I came up with something I was happy with. And so, Chapter 2X will be called Borders of Order. It's not the greatest title in the world, but I like the double meaning of this chapter being placed in between the chaotic chapter of poor visibility and enemies spawning all around you, and the more straightforward siege that will take place in Chapter 3. As well as it taking place on the actual border of the area that is under the control of the Sanctian Order, or once controlled by them depending on the branch of the story you went down. And when I did get around to placing enemies, I used a small math trick to diversify the reinforcements. I created 2 groups, one spawning every 3 turns, the other every 5 turns. Because these are both primary numbers, these 2 reinforcements won't overlap until turn 15, which is the point where if the player is somehow still playing this chase chapter, they should face some additional pressure, and their spawning will seem unpredictable if you don't realize this pattern. That plus the rest of the enemy placements for Chapter 2X were the last thing I've done over the last 2 weeks of working on Divine Dream. As always, a download link to the demo containing the first 2 chapters of this ROM hack is in the description. There you will also find a link to a Discord server, where you can report bugs, ask questions and give suggestions about my projects. Subscribe if you want to see updates on anything I work on, and until next time, farewell.